So just how badly did Michigan football miss Drew Henson and David Terrell that 2001 season, which would have been their senior years? Let's talk about it in this video. Welcome back to Big Discussions 76 Sports. My name is Dr. Anwar Youssef Dunbar. First of all, please like this video. Please share it. And please subscribe to my channel if you see fit. Shout out to Bo Lytle. Respect is earned. If you want to donate something to the channel, that information is below in the description box. You can also leave a super thanks, and also please consider joining the Big Words LLC Newsletter, as I am a writer. In addition to being a YouTube content creator, I have 2 blogs and a book project on the way, which deals with sports and what sports teach you about life at a young age. Okay, now that that's out of the way, let's talk about this video. How badly did Michigan football miss Drew Henson and David Terrell during the 2001 football season, which would have been their senior years? Where did this video come from? Well, we are in the off season of this current iteration of the Michigan Wolverines, coached by Jim Harbaugh, and now with J.J. McCarthy at the helm. So with it being the off season, this gives me the opportunity to do some historical retrospectives, and also to upload excerpts from live streams. And I recently uploaded an excerpt from a discussion I had with Michael Burden. Shout out to Michael Burden. He is a true maize and blue fan, and in that excerpt we talked about Drew Henson. I think in that stream, the question of that stream was, can Michigan win at the Horseshoe in Columbus for the first time since the 2000 season? And of course they did. But at the end of that stream, that was back in the summertime, Michael gave us the short version of how and why Drew Henson left after his junior season, and arguably changed the trajectory of the Michigan football program for at least the next 10 to 15 years. So I uploaded that excerpt, and then Ashwin, shout out to Ashwin. Ashwin is one of my most passionate followers and subscribers here. He comments on everything. Ashwin, I appreciate that. He watches everything and he comments on everything. Ashwin, I appreciate that. If you're watching this, if you're subbed here, you can watch and comment on everything too. You're welcome to do it. It doesn't cost you a thing, just a little bit of time. But Ashwin made the comment that Michigan's fortunes basically would have been different had Drew Henson and David Terrell come back for their senior seasons. And I thought that was worth doing a retrospective video on. So hence this video, that's what this is. So I'm going to ask the question, how much of a difference would Drew Henson and David Terrell have made had they come back for their senior seasons? And would Michigan's fortunes have been different had they come back? Let's talk about it.
Who's our starting quarterback? What time's the game? 3:30? You'll see then.
So to have this discussion, you have to talk about the 2000 season, what happened and what the expectations were going into that season. So going into that season, that was my second year of graduate school at the University of Michigan in the Department of Pharmacology. But that was what we thought was going to be the first of two seasons where Drew Henson would be the starting quarterback outright with no competition, or with very little competition. So the previous season was Tom Brady's last year. There were a lot of veterans on that team. That was a very, very talented team. It was a very, very capable team. And if not for a close loss up at Spartan Stadium, where Lloyd Carr used the platoon system with Tom Brady and Drew Henson, Michigan probably wins that game. And then if not for a close loss at home against Illinois, Michigan is arguably in the BCS championship game. There was no playoff back then, so your record had to be damn near perfect, and or things had to line up just right with all the other teams for you to get into the BCS championship game. But this was the first of 2 years in which Drew was going to hold the job all his own. What happened was Drew broke his, I think he broke his ankle in training camp. So Drew missed the first 3 games. So that was Drew. It was also with all those seniors graduating like Marcus Knight and Diallo Johnson. Now it was time for David Terrell to step further up into the limelight himself. So Michigan won its first 2 games against Cupcakes, teams from the non-Power 5 conferences. And then we lost a close game to UCLA out in Los Angeles. John Navarre got the start, a freshman John Navarre. And then Drew Henson came back. At Illinois, and Drew Henson engineered a comeback victory. I think John Navarre started that game, and Drew Henson engineered a comeback victory. I think the winning touchdown was him scrambling into the end zone for one of those touchdowns where the quarterback reaches out and breaks the plane. But after that, Michigan started rolling. I went to go see them play once that season. Wisconsin came in, and that was the matchup between David Terrell and Jamar Fletcher. There was some trash talk leading up to it. And I think the only score of that game was a jump ball that Drew threw to David Terrell in the end zone over Jamar Fletcher. Michigan won that game, I think, 10-7 or 10-3. The next loss came at Purdue at the hands of Drew Brees' Purdue Boilermaker spread offense. And then the next loss came against the Northwestern Wildcats, which were the Big Ten's version of the LA Rams' greatest show on turf. That was a 54-51 victory for Northwestern or something like that. But that game was lost off of an unlikely fumble by the normally sure-handed Anthony A. Train Thomas. So Michigan didn't lose any more that season. They lost those 3 games. They beat Ohio State, and then they won their bowl game against Auburn. Michigan beat an SEC opponent for the second straight year from Alabama. And so at the conclusion of that season, the prospects for their senior season looked really, really good. Now, Drew and David became quite a duo, and they were electric and they were dynamic. But make no mistakes about it, they weren't the only offensive players who were giving the Wolverines good production. Lining up opposite David Terrell was Marquise Walker, who I'm going to talk about later on in this video. I believe Benny Japru was playing tight end. Anthony Thomas, the A-Train, he was in the backfield. And you also had stellar veteran offensive linemen like Jeff Backus and Steve Hutchinson. So that whole offense was loaded, and it had a lot of explosiveness and a lot of pop. So how did Drew and David Terrell do in terms of production that season? And what did Michigan potentially miss out on during the 2001 season, which would have been their senior years? So first of all, Drew was a 6'4" quarterback. He weighed 219 pounds. And Drew only played 8 games that season, once again because of his early injury to his broken, I think it was either his broken ankle or his broken foot. It was one of those, a broken ankle or a broken foot. And John Navarre got to start because of that. So Drew only played 8 games that season. Drew went 131 for 217 completions per attempts. He had a completion percentage of 60.4%. He threw for 1,852 yards. He threw for 16 touchdowns, and he threw 4 interceptions. And he had I believe this is the quarterback rating. There's a difference between the quarterback rating or the passer rating. This didn't say which it was, but either way, it was 152.7. David Terrell stood 6'3", and he weighed 212 pounds. So he was about as tall as me. David Terrell was a tall receiver. I met him once in person on a Saturday night after a game. I think him and his posse were going to a party. I was leaving something, and him and his posse were walking in. I think he'd been a little bit, but that's beside the point. So he was 6'3" and 212 pounds. He played all 11 games that season. He caught 63 balls for 994 yards, receiving yards, and he caught 13 touchdown passes. So the previous year, I think he caught 4. Tom Brady was spreading it around, and Drew was dialing him up as much as he could that season. So the pair was very, very productive, and going into their senior seasons, one might have expected, had they stayed healthy, that they would have gave our football team that again, or they might have surpassed those numbers. So keeping those numbers in mind, let's take a look at how John Navarre did during that 2001 season and how his number one target, Marquise Walker, did, because once David Terrell left, Marquise Walker shifted over into the number one wide receiver spot. So he became John Navarre's target of choice his sophomore season. So John Navarre stood 6'6", and he weighed 240 pounds. So he was as tall as Michael Jordan. Drew was 6'4", John was 6'6", so they weren't that different in terms of height. What we found out, though, was Drew was more mobile, and Drew was more dynamic, and Drew was more explosive. John had a good arm. John broke a lot of passing records, but Drew was clearly the more explosive and dynamic player. Anyway, and John took a lot of criticism early on. I was there as a grad student. John took a lot of criticism. I think a lot of our fan base were looking for Drew Henson and Tom Brady like production, and John didn't give that to us right away. During the 2001 season, John Navarre went 186 for 346 in terms of completions and attempts, completions to attempts. He had a 53.8% completion percentage, so he threw more balls than Drew Henson did, and he had a lower completion percentage. He threw for 2,195 total yards, so he threw for more yards than Drew, but once again, Drew only played 8 games his junior season. He threw for 17 touchdowns and 12 interceptions. So Drew only threw 4 interceptions, John Navarre threw 12. Marquise Walker was 6'3", and 213 pounds. In 11 games, Marquise caught 81 balls for 1,043 yards and 11 touchdowns. So David Terrell he generated 994 yards. If you think about it, if Drew had played those first 3 games, David Terrell probably goes over 1,000 yards and has a yardage production on the level of what Marquise Walker had, but Drew was out for those first 3 games. So that's how the quarterbacks and their number 1 wide receivers matched up in the 2000 season and the 2001 season. So how did their teams match up overall? So the 2000 team went 9-3, and the 2001 team went 8-4. So there was a difference of only 1 game. But if you look at the schedules and if you look at the margins of those losses, the 2000 team in its losses, it only lost by each of those games. Each of those losses were less than 3 points, and I think all 3 of them were by 1 point. They were by 1 to 3 points. If you look at the losses for the 2001 team, the margins were a little bit wider, okay? And I'm thinking specifically about the Ohio State game. As you know, up until this year, Drew was the last quarterback to win at the shoe. JJ did it this year, but and we beat them. Well, the team beat Ohio State's team handily by about 12 to 14 points that day, and the game was won. The game was put away for good off of Drew's legs. He did a naked bootleg and ran around and ran in the end zone. The next year, after Jim Tressel's promise to the Ohio State fan base, they came up to Ann Arbor and they snatched a 26-20 victory from us. And I believe the last play of that game was, or the game sealing play was a John Navarre interception when he was throwing to Marquise Walker. Let's take a look at how John Navarre did in his first matchup against Ohio State in the 2001 season, and let's take a look at how Drew Henson did in the final regular season game of his junior season. Let's compare the two. So in that 2000 game at the shoe, Michigan defeated Ohio State 38-26. Drew went 14 for 25 for 303 yards. He threw for 3 touchdowns. He threw 1 pick. And 2 of those touchdowns were bombs to David Terrell. So earlier I said the 2 were explosive. They showed it in that game. Okay. During the 2001 season, when Ohio State came up and fulfilled Jim Tressel's prophecy, Ohio State won that game 26-20. John Navarre went 21 for 47 for 206 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 4 interceptions. Okay. The total rushing yardage for the 2000 game, where Anthony Thomas was the starting tailback, was 82 yards. And the total yardage for rushing in the 2001 game was 117 yards. But if you compare those passing numbers, John Navarre threw twice as many times for a third less of the yardage. And he threw 4 times as many picks. So I think those explain what happened to the 2 quarterbacks in those 2 games. But let's zero out a little bit and let's take a look at what happened when you compare the rushing yardage for the 2000 season and the 2001 season, because I think that tells a very important part of this story, separate from the quarterbacks and their go-to receivers. Now, something occurred to me prior to shooting this video, and I mentioned it earlier on, and that's that the 2000 offense was loaded. You had Drew, you had David Terrell, you had Marquise Walker, you had Anthony Thomas, you had a deep tight end group, you had Jeff Backus and Steve Hutchinson on the offensive line. So you had a veteran group, and it was loaded. And so when you think about the 2001 team, Drew and David were not the only players who didn't come back. Anthony Thomas graduated, as did Jeff Backus and Steve Hutchinson. So you had a very, very different running game. Instead of Anthony Thomas, you had a young Chris Perry and a young BJ Askew, okay, who were stepping into the starting position for the first time, and you had a younger, reshuffled offensive line. And the rushing yards reflect that for the season. So for the 2000 season, the Michigan running game generated 2,830 yards. In the 2001 season, the Michigan running game generated 2,021 yards. So there was a drop-off in the rushing yardage. And when there's a drop-off in the rushing yardage, that puts more pressure on the passing game. And it especially puts more pressure on a sophomore quarterback who's never started before and who's never been in the fire full time before. So I think in its totality, all of this data tells us, yes, Michigan absolutely did miss a veteran Drew Henson and a veteran David Terrell. And they arguably may have been able, with their talent, they may have been able to cover up that young running game in time for it to, allowing it time to mature. But while those two players were missed, clearly one of the major differences between the 2000 team and the 2001 team was the running game. So it wasn't just David Terrell and Drew Henson, it was also a running game that was missed as well, especially for that pro-style offense that Lloyd's teams were running back then before he retired. I'm going to wrap this video up by talking about how the fortunes of the Michigan program and the Ohio State program, the Big Ten, and maybe the rest of college football changed with Drew Henson and David Terrell leaving.
Proud of our young people in the classroom, in the community, and most especially in 310 days in Ann Arbor, Michigan, on the football field.
So with their combined talent, Drew and David may have been able to carry the Michigan offense while that young offensive line and while that young Chris Perry and BJ Askew figured out how to generate more yards on the ground. And maybe with David and Drew and with Marquise Walker on the other side, maybe they didn't need the Anthony Thomas, Jeff Backus, and Steve Hutchinson running game. Ashwin made a good comment underneath that excerpt, which was that Michigan, had Drew and David came back, Michigan could have potentially been in the BCS title game again. And they most likely probably beat Ohio State at home instead of that 26-20 loss to Jim Tressel's team. So I think that if Drew Henson and David Terrell come back, I think they win that Ohio State game. They win the Big Ten. They probably win the other games on the schedule that year. They went out to the West Coast for the second straight year, this time to Washington. I think it was Washington. Yeah, it was Washington. I know one year they went out to Oregon to play the Ducks, but those games are a bit of a coin toss, but Michigan only lost to UCLA by a few points the previous season. So in summary, the prospects for the football team are a lot better if Drew and David come back. Lloyd probably wins that first matchup with Jim Tressel. Michigan has a little more momentum when Drew leaves and John takes over. It's probably better for recruiting. Michigan arguably gets into the BCS championship game. Of course, we'll never know. At that point, there were a lot of pieces that had to fall into place for those two teams who qualified. But I tend to think that the fortunes for our football program would have been a lot different had those two players come back. But definitely the Michigan-Ohio State rivalry is different if those two players come back. And arguably, those two players leaving affected the trajectory of our two programs for the next 10 to 15 years. Lloyd gets at least one more win against Jim Tressel, and without building that momentum from that 2001 season, does Ohio State win? Do they go on their run the next season? I don't know. Drew would have eventually graduated. John Navarre would have eventually taken over. Chad Henne eventually would have taken over for John Navarre. Well, Chad Henne or Matt Gutierrez. If you haven't watched my Matt Gutierrez video, I'll leave that below in the description box. But little things like this change the fortunes for teams and programs and coaches and players for years to come. And I think that whether Drew just left because he wanted to play football, whether he wanted to play baseball that badly, or whether George Steinbrenner lured him away, Drew's departure and David Terrell's departure was significant for a lot of people, the fan bases, our coaches, our programs, everybody. They were significant, and it shows how decisions by a few can affect the fortunes of the many. All right, I'm going to wrap this video up. Thank you for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments section below. Please like, share, and subscribe if you see fit. Shout out to Bo Lytle, as respect is earned. If you want to donate something to the channel, that information is below in the description box. And you can also leave a super thanks. Please consider joining the Big Words LLC Newsletter. I'm a writer in addition to being a YouTube content creator, and I have a sports-related book on the way. Go Blue, and as always, remember that your attitude determines your altitude, and always try to do your best. Take care, and I'll talk to you the next time. Bye-bye. Hey guys, there are a few more things I wanted to say before I wrapped this one up. When you do these pre-records, you go through post-production, and then you wonder, you know what? Did I actually have that right? So you have to go back and then fact-check yourself to make sure that you're accurate and that everything you said was true, or most of what you said was true. So there were a couple things that I thought about, and I said, you know what? Did I get that right? So it turns out, yes, Drew Henson fractured his right foot in training camp leading up to the 2000 season. And it might have been one of the things that helped sway him to leaving Michigan to pursue his baseball dream, because for these college athletes, one big injury can ruin their pro prospects. So that was the first thing. The second thing was the Northwestern Wildcats, the Zach Kustok, Damian Anderson Northwestern Wildcats. I compared them to the NFL's Los Angeles Rams. It was actually the St. Louis Rams, because at that point they moved from Los Angeles to St. Louis, and we know that since then they've moved back to Los Angeles. But that was the Kurt Warner, Isaac Bruce, Torrey Holt, Marshall Faulk group. So it was St. Louis and not Los Angeles. And then the final thing was how bad the 2001 team's losses were. And the reality is they weren't that bad. They lost to the Washington Huskies 23-18 out in Seattle. They lost that controversial Clockgate, Jeff Smoker, TJ Duckett, Charles Rogers game up at Spartan Stadium. There was a lot that happened in that game. There's no time to get into it now. There was the 26-20 loss to Ohio State at home, fulfilling Jim Tressel's prophecy. And then finally, their most lopsided loss of that season was that 45-17 beatdown at the hands of Coach Phil Fulmer's Tennessee Volunteers in the Citrus Bowl. So that's it. I just wanted to fact check myself a little bit, and that's it. I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.